Maria Rodriguez thought she was just being kind when she left breakfast for the homeless man who sat quietly across from her cafe every morning. She had no idea he was Colonel Robert Hayes, a decorated Marine whose life she was saving one meal at a time until 12 Marines in dress blues appeared at her wedding. The Sunrise Cafe occupied a corner storefront in downtown Phoenix, its large windows offering a clear view of the small urban park across the street, where office workers grabbed quick lunches and homeless individuals sought shade under the desert sun. The morning light streamed through those windows, illuminating mismatched tables and chairs that gave the cafe a homey feel despite its urban location. The smell of fresh coffee and breakfast burritos filled the air, while the soft chatter of early commuters mixed with the distant hum of city traffic. A weathered park bench sat directly across from the cafe's main window, positioned under an old mesquite tree that provided the only shade in the small concrete plaza. Maria Rodriguez arrived at her cafe every morning at 5:30 a.m., unlocking the door with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built something meaningful from nothing. At 28, she possessed the kind of determined optimism that had carried her family through immigration and helped her transform a struggling coffee shop into a neighborhood gathering place. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her apron bore the cheerful stains of a day's work that hadn't yet begun. Maria had purchased the Sunrise Cafe 3 years earlier, with savings accumulated through years of working multiple jobs, driven by a dream of creating a place where people could find comfort and community. The cafe served traditional Mexican breakfast dishes alongside American favorites, and Maria knew most of her regular customers by name, remembering their orders and asking about their families with genuine interest. What set Maria apart wasn't just her business acumen or her cooking skills, it was her instinctive compassion for people who were struggling. She had grown up in a family where sharing food was an expression of love, and where helping those in need was considered a fundamental responsibility rather than an optional kindness. This upbringing would soon lead her to notice someone who needed help more than he was willing to admit. Every morning, for the past 6 months, Maria had observed the same elderly man sitting on the bench across from her cafe. He appeared to be homeless, but unlike others in similar circumstances, he maintained a dignity and cleanliness that suggested a different kind of story. He never approached customers for money, never caused disturbances, and always cleaned up after himself if he ate anything. Something about his bearing, the way he sat with military straightness, the careful way he folded his few possessions, suggested that his current circumstances didn't match his character. Maria felt compelled to help, but she sensed that direct charity might offend his obvious pride. The decision to help came naturally to Maria, but implementing it required sensitivity and respect for the man's dignity. She couldn't simply walk over and offer food. His body language made it clear that he valued his privacy and independence. Instead, Maria developed a subtle approach that would allow him to accept help without feeling like he was receiving charity. Her solution was elegantly simple. Each morning, after the breakfast rush began to slow, Maria would prepare an extra meal, usually scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon, along with a large coffee. She would place the food in a clean container with a note that simply said, "Have a good day," and set it on the bench when the man stepped away for his morning walk around the block. The first few times, Maria wasn't sure if he would take the food or if he might be offended by the gesture. She watched nervously from the cafe window as he returned to find the meal waiting for him. But when she saw him sit down, read the note, and begin eating with obvious gratitude, she knew she had found the right approach. The routine continued for weeks, with Maria leaving breakfast and the man accepting it with quiet dignity. Neither acknowledged the arrangement directly, but Maria could see that he was gaining weight and looking healthier. Maria's plan was to continue the breakfast routine indefinitely, asking nothing in return and expecting no acknowledgement. She found deep satisfaction in this anonymous act of kindness, and the small cost of the extra meals was easily absorbed by her cafe's growing success. Her fiancé, David, supported her decision, though he worried about her safety and suggested that she be careful about establishing patterns that might attract unwanted attention. But Maria's actions didn't go unnoticed by others in the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the flower shop next door, disapproved of what she saw as enabling behavior that would attract more homeless people to the area. "You're just encouraging them to stay," she complained to Maria. "Pretty soon, we'll have a whole camp of them living in the park." Other neighbors had different reactions. Officer Martinez, who patrolled the area regularly, noticed the arrangement and privately admired Maria's compassion. Several of her regular customers also observed the daily ritual and began leaving larger tips, understanding that Maria was using her own resources to help someone in need. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely in comfortable anonymity. But circumstances were about to force a more direct interaction between Maria and the man whose life she was quietly supporting. The breakthrough came on a particularly rainy morning, when the man's usual shelter under the mesquite tree proved inadequate against the desert downpour. Maria watched from her cafe window as he huddled on the bench, his thin jacket soaked through and his few possessions getting wet despite his efforts to protect them. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed an umbrella and crossed the street. "Sir," she called out, "would you like to wait out the rain inside the cafe? You're welcome to sit by the window." For the first time in months of silent interaction, the man looked directly at her. His eyes were clear and intelligent, and when he spoke, his voice carried the educated cadence of someone who had once held authority. "Thank you for the kind offer, miss," he said with formal politeness, "but I don't want to impose on your business or make your customers uncomfortable." Maria was struck by his articulate speech and courteous manner. "You wouldn't be imposing at all," she assured him. "I'm Maria, and this is my cafe. You'd be my guest." But the man politely declined, introducing himself simply as Robert and thanking her for months of kindness that he had never directly acknowledged before. The brief conversation in the rain marked the beginning of a gradual relationship that developed over the following weeks. Robert began arriving at the bench earlier each morning, timing his presence to coincide with Maria's opening routine. Their interactions were still minimal, a nod of acknowledgement, a brief "good morning," and occasional comments about the weather. But the ice had been broken. Maria learned that Robert was indeed a veteran, though he was reluctant to discuss his military service in detail. He spoke with obvious education and intelligence, using vocabulary and references that suggested extensive reading and formal training. When Maria asked about his circumstances, Robert would deflect the questions with gentle humor, or change the subject to inquire about her cafe or her plans for the future. What became clear was that Robert's homelessness wasn't the result of addiction, mental illness, or inability to work. He maintained his personal hygiene, spoke coherently about current events, and demonstrated the kind of self-discipline that suggested military training. Maria began to suspect that his circumstances were the result of choice rather than necessity, though she couldn't understand what would drive someone to choose life on the streets. Robert's presence also began to have a positive effect on the neighborhood, as his quiet dignity and respectful behavior challenged stereotypes about homeless individuals. Word of Maria's daily kindness began to spread through the community in ways she hadn't anticipated. Local news reporter Sarah Chen, who frequented the cafe for her morning coffee, noticed the routine and was intrigued by the story of quiet compassion playing out across the street. When she approached Maria about featuring the story, Maria politely declined, explaining that she didn't want to embarrass Robert or turn his situation into a spectacle. But the story took on a life of its own as other customers began to take notice. Some, inspired by Maria's example, started leaving their own contributions, extra food, clothing, or small amounts of money. Others began engaging Robert in conversation, discovering his intelligence and dignity despite his circumstances. The attention wasn't entirely positive. Mrs. Henderson escalated her complaints to the city, arguing that the cafe was attracting undesirable elements to the business district. A few customers expressed concern about safety and the appropriateness of encouraging homeless individuals to congregate in the area. But the majority of responses were supportive, with many customers specifically choosing to patronize the Sunrise Cafe because they admired Maria's compassion. The cafe's business actually increased as word spread about the young woman who fed a homeless man every morning without fanfare or expectation of recognition. The relationship between Maria and Robert deepened significantly when David Maria's fiancé began joining their morning conversations. As a social worker, David had experience with homeless individuals and veterans, and he recognized signs in Robert that suggested a more complex story than simple economic hardship. During one conversation about Maria's upcoming wedding, Robert surprised them both by asking if there was anything he could do to help with the preparations. "I don't have much to offer," he said with characteristic humility, "but I'd like to contribute something to your special day if you'll let me." Maria was touched by the offer, but couldn't imagine what Robert might be able to provide. When she gently suggested that his presence and friendship were contribution enough, Robert smiled mysteriously and said, "You've given me more than food these past months, Maria. You've given me back my sense of worth. I'd like to return the favor in a way that might surprise you." The cryptic comment puzzled both Maria and David, but Robert refused to elaborate. Instead, he asked for the date and location of their wedding, explaining that he wanted to make sure he could do something special to honor their kindness. Maria provided the information, though she couldn't imagine what Robert had in mind. As Maria's wedding day approached, Robert's behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. He started arriving at the bench earlier and staying longer, often pulling out a cell phone that Maria had never seen before and making quiet calls. His appearance also began to improve. His clothes were cleaner and better maintained, and he seemed to be taking more care with his personal grooming. When Maria asked about the changes, Robert simply smiled and said he was making some arrangements. The mystery deepened when Officer Martinez mentioned that he had seen Robert talking with several well-dressed men who had the bearing of military personnel. The conversations were always brief and conducted away from the cafe. But Martinez's trained eye recognized the signs of former military members recognizing each other. David became increasingly curious about Robert's background, especially after observing his knowledge of military protocol and his obvious leadership qualities during their conversations. But every attempt to learn more about Robert's service record or current circumstances met with polite deflection. 3 days before the wedding, Robert approached Maria with an unusual request. He wanted to know if she would be walking from the church to the cafe for her reception, and if so, what route she planned to take. The question seemed odd, but Maria provided the information, trusting that Robert's intentions were good. The morning of Maria's wedding brought an unexpected revelation that would transform everything she thought she knew about Robert. As she arrived at the cafe early to prepare for the day's closure and her afternoon ceremony, she found Robert waiting with a manila envelope and an expression of nervous determination. "Maria," he said, his voice carrying more formality than she had ever heard from him, "before your wedding day begins, there's something I need to tell you about who I really am." Inside the envelope was a military identification card that made Maria's breath catch in her throat. The photograph showed a younger version of Robert in dress blues, but the name and rank were what shocked her. Colonel Robert Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired. The ID was accompanied by commendation letters, service records, and photographs that documented a distinguished 30-year military career, including multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. "You're a colonel," Maria whispered, struggling to reconcile the homeless man she had been feeding with the decorated officer whose credentials lay spread before her. Robert nodded, his eyes showing the pain of memories he had kept buried. "I commanded over 2,000 Marines during my career. I was responsible for their lives, their training, their welfare, and I failed them in ways that cost good people their lives." The revelation that the man she had been helping was not just a veteran, but a high-ranking officer whose service record included some of the most dangerous operations in recent military history, completely changed Maria's understanding of their relationship. Robert's story poured out with the force of emotions that had been suppressed for years. After his wife Sarah died of cancer, he had been consumed by survivor's guilt that extended beyond his military service to his personal life. He had been overseas during her final months, commanding troops in Afghanistan while she fought her own battle at home. When he returned for her funeral, the weight of all the losses, his fallen Marines, his wife, his sense of purpose, had crushed his ability to function in normal society. "I had a pension, a house savings," Robert explained, his voice breaking with emotion. "But I couldn't live with the comfort when so many good people were gone. I gave everything away and came to the streets because I felt like I deserved nothing better." Maria listened with growing understanding as Robert described the depression and self-imposed exile that had brought him to the park bench across from her cafe. "For 2 years, I just existed. I wasn't living, just surviving each day, and then you started leaving those meals." The impact of Maria's simple kindness became clear as Robert continued, "You never asked questions, never made me feel like a charity case, never tried to fix me. You just showed me that I was worth feeding, worth caring about. Day by day, meal by meal, you reminded me that I was still human." But Robert's revelation was leading to something bigger than just personal gratitude. I've been making some calls to my old unit to Marines I served with who are now spread across the country. I told them about what you've done not just for me, but the way you've treated me with dignity and respect. They want to do something special for your wedding. Maria's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of Robert's words. The mysterious phone calls, the well-dressed visitors, the questions about her wedding route, it was all beginning to make sense. As Maria prepared to leave for her wedding ceremony, Robert made one final request that would set the stage for the most memorable moment of her special day. Maria, I want you to know that what happens today isn't about me or my rank or my military service. It's about recognizing the kind of person you are and the impact that simple kindness can have on someone's life. He handed her a folded American flag, worn but carefully maintained. This flag flew over our base in Afghanistan during my final deployment. I want you to have it as a symbol of the service you provided not to your country, but to a fellow human being who had forgotten his own worth. Maria accepted the flag with trembling hands, understanding that she was holding something sacred to Robert and to the men he had commanded. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "That's exactly why you do deserve it," Robert replied. "You helped someone not because you expected recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. That's the same spirit that drives the best Marines I've ever known." As Maria left for her wedding, she had no idea that Robert's gratitude was about to manifest in a way that would honor her kindness before an entire community. The wedding ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church proceeded beautifully, with Maria radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, and David beaming with pride as they exchanged vows before family and friends. The couple had planned a simple reception at the Sunrise Cafe, wanting to celebrate their marriage in the place where their relationship had deepened and where Maria had built her dreams. As the wedding party prepared to walk the 6 blocks from the church to the cafe, Maria noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked along the route, black sedans and SUVs that seemed out of place in the neighborhood. David mentioned seeing men in suits who appeared to be coordinating some kind of event, but neither of them connected these observations to Robert's mysterious preparations. The wedding photographer captured the joy of the moment as Maria and David followed by their wedding party, and guests began the traditional walk through their neighborhood toward the cafe. Maria waved to familiar faces along the route, including Officer Martinez, who was directing traffic with an unusually formal bearing. As they approached the final block before the cafe, Maria could see that a crowd had gathered much larger than she had expected for their modest reception. For a moment, Maria felt overwhelmed by the attention their wedding was receiving. She had always preferred quiet acts of service to public recognition, and the size of the crowd waiting at the cafe made her nervous. "What if this is too much?" she whispered to David. "What if people think we're showing off?" David squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Maria, everyone here knows who you are and what you've done for this community. They're here because they love you, not because they expect a show." But as they rounded the final corner and the Sunrise Cafe came into view, Maria gasped at a sight that was beyond anything she could have imagined. Standing in perfect formation in front of her cafe were 12 Marines in dress blue uniforms, their white caps gleaming in the afternoon sun and their bearing reflecting the discipline and honor of the Corps. At the head of the formation stood Robert, but this wasn't the homeless man she had been feeding for months. Colonel Robert Hayes stood at attention in his dress blue uniform, the ribbons and decorations on his chest telling the story of a distinguished military career that Maria was only now beginning to understand. The transformation was complete, and stunning gone was the humble, homeless man replaced by an officer whose bearing commanded immediate respect and attention. As Maria and David approached, the 12 Marines came to attention with the precision that only comes from years of training and shared service. The sound of their synchronized movement echoed off the buildings, and the crowd of wedding guests and neighborhood observers fell silent in recognition of the solemnity of the moment. Maria felt her knees go weak as she realized that this ceremony was for her, organized by the man she had been quietly helping for months, executed by Marines who had traveled from across the country to honor her simple acts of kindness. The emotional impact of seeing Robert in his true identity, surrounded by the Marines he had served with, was almost overwhelming for Maria. She had spent months thinking of him as someone who needed her help, only to discover that he was a decorated officer whose service record included some of the most challenging military operations of the past 2 decades. "I don't understand," she whispered to David, who was equally stunned by the display of military honor taking place in front of their neighborhood cafe. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of command, but softened by genuine emotion. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, using her married name for the first time, "these Marines have come from 12 different states to honor you today. They represent the men and women I had the privilege to command, and they're here because your story has inspired them." The formality of the moment contrasted sharply with the months of casual morning conversations, creating a surreal experience that Maria struggled to process. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most moving displays of military honor they had ever witnessed. Colonel Hayes raised his hand in salute, and the 11 other Marines followed suit, creating a wall of tribute that honored Maria's compassion and service to their former commanding officer. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Colonel Hayes announced, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered crowd. "You fed a Marine when he was hungry, showed kindness when he was forgotten, and treated him with dignity when he had forgotten his own worth. In doing so, you upheld the values that we swore to defend: honor, courage, and commitment." Each Marine then stepped forward individually to shake Maria's hand and thank her personally. They came from different units, different generations of service, but they shared a common bond forged through military service and a common respect for the woman who had shown unconditional kindness to their former commander. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had served under Colonel Hayes in Afghanistan, spoke for the group. "Ma'am, you saved our colonel's life, not just physically, but spiritually. You reminded him that he was worth saving, and in doing so, you honored every Marine who ever served under his command." The presentation of colors followed, with the Marines unfurling a large American flag, while a bugler played taps in honor of fallen comrades and in celebration of the values that Maria had demonstrated through her daily acts of service. The ceremony concluded with Colonel Hayes presenting Maria with a framed certificate that designated her as an honorary member of his former unit, along with a challenge coin that bore the insignia of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. "This coin represents the Brotherhood of Marines," he explained, and you've earned your place in that brotherhood through service that exemplifies the best of what we strive to be. But the greatest moment came when Colonel Hayes made an announcement that surprised even the Marines who had traveled to honor Maria Mrs. Rodriguez. I've been working with veteran organizations to establish a program that will help homeless veterans transition back to productive lives. I'd like to name this program the Sunrise Initiative, in honor of your cafe and your example of how simple kindness can change lives. The applause that followed wasn't just for Maria. It was for the power of compassion to transform both the giver and the receiver. The wedding reception that followed the Marine ceremony was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. The 12 Marines, still in their dress uniforms, mingled with wedding guests and shared stories about Colonel Hayes's leadership and Maria's impact on their former commander's life. Mrs. Henderson, who had complained about Maria feeding the homeless man, approached with tears in her eyes to apologize for her earlier criticism and to ask how she could help support the new veteran program. Local media, alerted by the unusual sight of Marines in formation at a wedding, arrived to document the story. But Maria insisted that any coverage focus on the needs of homeless veterans rather than her own actions. The story that emerged highlighted the Sunrise Initiative and the broader issue of veteran homelessness, turning Maria's wedding day into a platform for raising awareness about a critical social problem. The cafe's transformation from a simple neighborhood eatery to a symbol of community compassion was immediate and profound, with customers traveling from across Phoenix to visit the place where kindness had changed lives. The Sunrise Initiative became a model program for veteran transition services, combining housing assistance with job training and mental health support. Colonel Hayes came out of retirement to direct the program, using his military leadership skills to coordinate services for veterans across Arizona. Maria's Cafe became the program's unofficial headquarters, with a dedicated section called the Morning Bench, where veterans could find resources, support, and community. The story of Maria's kindness inspired similar programs in other cities, with cafe owners, restaurant managers, and community leaders reaching out to learn how they could replicate the Sunrise model in their own neighborhoods. The Marine Corps officially recognized Maria's contribution to veteran welfare, making her the first civilian to receive the Corps' Community Service Award. Most importantly, the program helped over 200 homeless veterans find housing and employment in its first year, proving that Colonel Hayes's faith in Maria's approach to service was well-founded. 1 year after her wedding, Maria stood behind the counter of her expanded cafe, watching Colonel Hayes counsel a young veteran who was struggling with the transition to civilian life. The morning routine continued, coffee brewing, breakfast cooking, and quiet acts of kindness happening throughout the day. "You know," Colonel Hayes said during a quiet moment, "I never properly thanked you for saving my life." Maria smiled, wiping down the counter with the same care she brought to everything she did. "Robert, you don't save someone's life just once. You do it every day, one small kindness at a time.